Chapter 24 of The Beautiful Mrs. Davenant by Violet Tweedale. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 24. Mrs. Davenant Decides. The small world surrounding the lake house had known too little of Geoffrey Thorpe to care very much whether he lived or died. Only Mrs. Hall's triumphant assertion, "Didn't I foretell his death before the new year?" revived the flickering interest in his passing, the consensus of opinion being that Harry Thorpe's succession was an excellent thing for all and sundry. So useless a member of the community was better dead than alive, and a young couple would add considerably to the social amenities. Even the discovery of the dead body of a one-armed, drowned man in the lake proved but a transitory excitement. Clearly this was some wretched tramp, judging by his clothes and emaciation, and doubtless he had lost an arm in the war. Such countless men were now without an arm or a leg, and it was natural to Harry Thorpe's charming nature to give this nameless stranger a foot or two of ground formerly sacred to the ashes of the Thorpe family. Life had been very cheap during the last 5 years, and there were such numberless derelicts drifting about the world that this nameless corpse aroused no suspicion and but little interest. Only a few days after the burial of Geoffrey Thorpe, his successor had discovered a dead man floating on the surface of the water, and the unidentified remains had been reverently carried to the lake house, where they remained until the coroner had held the futile inquest. Events, even in a country parish, now marched with such incredible swiftness that before one thrill could be really enjoyed, another had superseded it. Popular interest was now centred entirely around the vicarage, which was about to provide 2 weddings for the delectation of the neighbourhood. Letty's approaching marriage had been somewhat cast into the shade by the public announcement that the vicar would shortly take to wife the stately and wealthy Agnes Howard. Letty was to be married from the vicarage, and she remained there busily completing her simple outfit, whilst Harry resigned from his work in London and installed himself in his new home. Mrs. Geoffrey Thorpe had not waited for the funeral of her husband, but had departed the day after his death for an unknown destination. Only too thankful to escape punishment for her complicity in crime, she could be trusted to remain silent. Upon that day, Letty, Harry, and Warburton entered the left wing for the first time, and penetrated the room which for so many years had been Mark Thorpe's prison. The 2 men would gladly have spared the girl from the tragic ordeal, but Letty resolutely insisted on taking her place by Harry's side. She was well aware that much of the work of obliteration to be done there was woman's work, and there was but one woman to whom it could safely be entrusted. Until all evidence of Geoffrey Thorpe's crime had been removed, no stranger could be admitted to work in the house, and meanwhile Harry had arranged to sleep at the vicarage, and with Letty and Warburton returned to his property by day. The window of the prison still stood wide, and outside it was 1 bar missing, which was safely retrieved from the ground below. The removal of all the bars was a task Harry felt must be carried out by himself before the house was set in working order again. Luckily, rust had done its insidious work, and the task would not be too hard, nor was there any pressing hurry for its accomplishment. For an hour or 2 the 3 worked at removing all traces of occupation, and the result was a bonfire in the yard. Geoffrey Thorpe had to a certain extent been mindful of his captive's bodily comforts, and the state of the room was less terrible than they had anticipated, but still there were abundant evidences of a life lived in brutal durance. The last flickering sparks of reason had been secretly employed in preparations for escape. Probably, had those preparations been continuous, that escape would have been sooner attempted, but there must have been long periods during which no effort towards freedom was made. The door of stout oak was protected not only by a lock and key, but by a chain and padlock, roughly but very securely adjusted. Geoffrey Thorpe had reason to believe his prisoner was safe, but the cunning of insanity had supplemented the normal craving for freedom, and Mark Thorpe had undoubtedly feigned a weakness beyond reality, and so thrown his gaoler off guard. The efforts of Letty and Harry were next directed towards preparing a few rooms for their immediate use. Carpets were taken up and floors cleaned, and the beautiful old furniture rearranged. Only by slow stages could the lake house be restored to its pristine glory, but that would be a labour of love to its active young owners. In those days of preparation, Hilda Davenant took an enthusiastic part. She constantly motored over to help in the laborious work of selecting what was valueless from the accumulation of letters and documents overflowing drawers and old dower chests. There were days spent in lumber rooms which appeared not to have been entered for 100 years, and huge cupboards to be overhauled, which were crammed with china and grand old silver, black with neglect. Often Harry and Letty whispered together of this strange turn of destiny's wheel, which had brought into active co-partnership Hilda Davenant. All this hidden away and forgotten wealth had but a few weeks previously belonged to her husband. Even the reckless Mark Thorpe had once accepted the words, "With all my worldly goods I thee endow," and Letty could not free herself from the feeling that she was really dealing with Hilda's property. That lady had, however, no thoughts of possession in her mind, though very often, when discovering a piece of silver or china of great value, she had remembered her husband's constant lament that there was nothing left of any value in the ramshackle old place. Undoubtedly he had believed this, for a bachelor on inheriting a property rarely concerns himself with the workers' portion of the house. His own special quarters and the pictures interest him, and possibly some obviously valuable pieces of furniture, but he leaves garrets and lumber rooms to the spiders and rats, and so misses much that is worth reclaiming. Mark had raised money at various times by selling pictures by painters who at that period were the rage, but luckily his ignorance of art and what the house really contained had saved very much for his successors. All he had really been interested in was the rent roll, and when that had failed to satisfy his reckless extravagance, he had heavily mortgaged the property. Much of this burden had been paid off by Geoffrey Thorpe during his years of seclusion, and Mrs. Davenant's munificent wedding gift was to be the total redemption of the existing debt. In those days, passed amid the dusty treasures of the lake house, Hilda regained much of her old gaiety of spirits and buoyancy of mind. She was free at last, and in the presence of the lovers, who knew the secret of how lately she had been widowed, she had no need to assume a sorrow she did not feel. The sadness that would formerly have been inseparable from the loss of Agnes Howard as her devoted daily companion was now eased by the fresh interest in her life which revolved so closely round Letty and Harry. She could look forward to the marriage of Agnes with equanimity, for there would really be no parting. The vicarage lay but a stone's throw from Little Glentworth. Little Glentworth! When she thought of the Dower House, her mind inevitably turned to Claude Carlton. He was home again on Christmas leave, and had called twice, but she had avoided seeing him. What was to be the end of that budding romance? Mrs. Davenant had quite decided that she would never marry a second time. She had told her life story for the last time, and to remarry with a secret hidden in her heart never even occurred to her. The recent tragedy had brought to mind so many things that in the course of years had become vague and misty. That one glimpse of her husband's face had rushed back to memory his callous brutality and the insults he perpetually had heaped upon her. The poignant agony she had suffered when he had gone to prison, leaving her friendless, penniless, and alone with her dead child, surged back upon her with the freshness of but yesterday. It required all her strength of mind to thrust those memories back again into their grim past, and to shut the door of life upon them for ever. At last she was free and at peace, and only if she remained free could she forget. To marry again would be but to perpetuate the misery. She told herself that the true ethical philosophy was to bring into the lives of others some, at least, of the ideal joy that for so short a time had been hers. Thus she strove, as much as was within her power, to take the place of parents to Letty and Harry. How often in her life she had thought, if all the world was simply kind, what a paradise it might be! And she took the keenest pleasure in carrying out the gift she so often had failed to receive from the hands of others. Her nature was essentially hopeful and courageous, and experiences which would have embittered others only wrought in her new strength and sweetness. There had been a time, not so long ago, when she had thought very regretfully of her inability to accept Carlton's manifest intentions. Now that she was certain of her freedom, the tragic circumstances that had brought it about seemed to have robbed it of its value. Legally free, she still would be fettered by that past, which was so blended with sordid misery, unconventional happiness, and sensational crime. Mine is a story which can never be told again, and the proof of that is what you and I are about to do to-night, Agnes, she said, as the two women sat alone over the teacups by the warm fireside on the night of the great Glentworth ball. So entirely am I divorced from my past that 10 days after Mark Thorpe's burial I am going to put on my best white satin frock and all my jewels and endeavour to enjoy myself thoroughly. Is that not the answer to your question, will I eventually marry Claude Carlton? So long as I am free, I can snap my fingers at the world, but no sooner were I bound by remarriage than my life would become a martyrdom of fear, lest the world should hit upon my past and injure my husband. Calumny can do nothing to me, but it could render miserable a life tied to mine. I know you're right and wise, Hilda, but I hate having to confess it, replied Agnes regretfully. I had hoped that some day you would be free to marry a man you cared for. I feel appallingly selfish in leaving you, but— Oh, yes, there's a big but, returned Hilda tranquilly. I'm convinced I'm wise to shelter behind it. I'm not the sort of woman Claude Carlton ought to marry. My past will always stream out behind me like a comet's tail, and I'd never be able to suppress it. It's too interwoven with the secret of the lake house to be given away again. I have those others to think of, Letty and Harry. No, I prefer to be regarded as a mystery rather than as a scandal. Besides, I'm years older than Claude Carlton, and the perpetual conflict with that disparity is more than I fancy undertaking. There's nothing so hard for a woman as to look younger than her face, and I hope I may never live to be called well-preserved. You've got no wrinkles because you've never had a husband. The two are inseparable. Think of it! Just as Claude arrived at the prime of life, I would be well on into the sere and yellow. What an appalling struggle that would entail! Oh, the utter weariness of attempting not to look like his mother! Picture to yourself our social career in 10 years' time, when Claude would be only 40, and I would be, well, we'll say considerably older. When we had a house party with no one over 40, and I, feeling age in all my bones, being obliged to get into my best corsets, my smartest wig, and my latest dream of a frock from Paris, instead of a comfy tea-gown and a boudoir cap. Think of the hours I should have to spend in my chemical laboratory, filling in the wrinkles and laying on the rouge, and after all my labours catching the aside of some naughty young minx. Oh, poor old thing, how tired she looks! Why doesn't she go to bed and leave us? No, my dear, I've seen it too often to try it on myself. It's not good enough. Agnes laughed. She loved to hear Hilda return to her whimsical moods of gentle cynicism. You are a woman who will never have any age, Hilda. Men will more or less be in love with you when you're 90. When beauty departs, you can always remain a good pal." Hilda made a little grimace as she lit a cigarette. The woman who has once been a charmer does well to avoid being only a comrade. There comes a time in every woman's life when she wishes to be treated as a reasonable human being, and possess her bedroom as a secret retreat unto herself. I mean to be free to do my hair with a fork if it pleases me, and to go to bed at 9 o'clock without having to lock my door. Makers of epigrams wouldn't acknowledge it, but there are women who were beauties in their youth and only ask for a plain old age. End of chapter 24.